The story of how communism came to life in the East and how it quickly turned into a nightmare for the West does not begin with Stalin or even with Lenin standing on the platform of the Finland station. It begins with an idea, with words written decades earlier by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who imagined a world where the working class would rise, overthrow the ruling elites, and create a society without private property and without exploitation. For many in the industrial cities of Europe in the 19th century, this sounded like prophecy. For governments and monarchs, it sounded like a threat. But in the beginning, it was only theory, debated in books and pamphlets, whispered in factories, carried by exiles who had no power. Lenin was a man who wanted to turn those words into reality. Born into a provincial family, educated in law but obsessed with politics, he read Marx not as philosophy, but as a manual of action. For him, the writings were not speculation, they were a program. And Russia at the dawn of the 20th century seemed like the perfect ground for such a program. It was a vast empire with huge masses of peasants and workers, ruled by a monarch who still believed in divine right. The gulf between the poor and the privileged was immense. Revolutionary fire was already smoldering. What Lenin did was to focus it, to give it structure, and to convince a small but determined party that they could seize history itself. When the First World War broke out, that fire spread. For the Russian state, the war was a catastrophe. Millions of peasants were thrown into uniform. The army was poorly equipped. Food shortages struck the cities, and faith in the Tsar collapsed. Lenin, who had been in exile in Switzerland, saw this as the opening he had been waiting for. His slogans were simple, almost brutal: peace, bread, land. The war must end, the peasants must be given the soil they worked, and the hungry must eat. These words did not sound like philosophy. They sounded like survival. In the autumn of the 17th year, the Bolsheviks took power in Petrograd. The October Revolution was more a coup than a mass rising, but its impact was seismic. In the eyes of the West, something almost unthinkable had happened. A group of radical socialists, hardly more than a faction, had seized control of a vast empire, and not only seized control, but announced that they would build an entirely new society, one that would destroy capitalism itself. For London, Paris, and Washington, this was not just a Russian drama. It was a signal that the plague of revolution could spread. The first decrees of Lenin's government shocked the old world. Land was taken from noble families and declared property of the peasants. Factories were placed under workers' control. Banks were nationalized. Foreign debts were repudiated. The entire foundation of private property was being ripped away. To many ordinary people in Europe and America, this was electrifying. Newspapers carried reports of a country where the poor had risen and were taking everything into their hands. To the governments and industrialists who read the same reports, it was terrifying. Western powers responded with both contempt and fear. They called Lenin's government illegitimate. They said it would not last. But at the same time, they sent troops and money to aid the White Armies in the Russian Civil War. British, American, French, Japanese soldiers landed on Russian soil, officially to secure supplies or protect interests, but in reality to crush the new power before it could consolidate. This intervention was not decisive, but it revealed how seriously the West took the new regime. The fear was not only about Russia. It was about the possibility that workers in Berlin, Paris, even New York, might be inspired to follow the same path. Lenin understood this perfectly. He did not want to build socialism only in Russia. He wanted revolution to spread across the world. His dream was that the October uprising would be the first domino, soon followed by Germany, Hungary, and beyond. That is why he founded the Third International, known as the Comintern, a body whose open purpose was to encourage and guide revolutions everywhere. This was a declaration of war, not by armies, but by ideology, and the Western leaders heard it loud and clear. Inside Russia, the reality of revolution was far darker than the slogans. The economy collapsed, famine stalked the land, millions died in the chaos of civil war. Yet the Bolsheviks held on. They held on through the ruthless use of the secret police, through executions of opponents, through what they called the Red Terror. They held on because Lenin believed that survival was victory, that every year the new regime endured was another year of proof that communism could live. And to the West, that endurance was proof that the threat was real. By the early 20s, the Soviet state was still fragile, but it had survived everything thrown against it: invasion, counter-revolution, hunger, disease. This survival alone unsettled the Western world. Leaders in London and Paris had assumed that Lenin would fall within months. Instead, he was sending messages of solidarity to workers abroad, calling on them to rise against their own governments. The Russian experiment was no longer a curiosity. It was an alternative model of society, proclaimed with defiance. This was the beginning of the long tension that would define the century. The West had seen revolutions before, but this was different. The French Revolution had terrified monarchs, but it had eventually produced another empire. The Russian Revolution was preaching a complete destruction of capitalism itself, and its leaders seemed determined to export it. Every strike in Europe, every march of workers, every political agitation was now interpreted through the lens of Bolshevik influence. Whether or not Moscow was behind them, fear made it seem so. Lenin himself was already ill, his health broken by years of strain and an assassination attempt. Yet even as he weakened, he kept pressing forward. He ordered new campaigns against illiteracy, against old traditions, against the church. Everything must be remade, he insisted, because only a completely new world could protect the revolution. To his followers, he was the prophet of a new age. To his enemies abroad, he was the face of a nightmare that might cross borders. The death of the old empire had shaken the global order. The birth of Soviet Russia promised that more shocks would come. The Western capitals watched with growing unease, some predicting collapse, others warning that this was only the first wave of a tide that could reach them all. In the autumn of the 17th year, a storm had begun, and by the time Lenin left the stage a few years later, it was clear that the storm would not easily pass. The fear in the West was not only about armies, but about ideas. Armies could be defeated, but ideas could spread invisibly, carried by books, by exiles, by whispers in factories. The idea that the poor could rise and take everything, that kings and bankers could be swept away, that was an idea more dangerous than any weapon. And in the years to come, with Stalin rising to power, that idea would be hammered into steel and concrete, turned into a system that would confront the West, not just as a rumor, but as a superpower. When Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd, the act itself seemed fragile, a desperate gamble by a small party that commanded only limited support. Many in the West assumed it would collapse within weeks, but instead of fading, the revolution expanded into a struggle that consumed the entire Russian land. The civil war that followed was not only an internal conflict, it became the stage on which the West first saw communism as a living, breathing, and dangerous reality. The forces against the Bolsheviks were numerous. There were the White Armies, composed of former officers loyal to the old order, nationalists who wanted independence for their regions, and moderates who hoped for a different kind of republic. There were foreign troops, British and French in the north, Americans in Siberia, Japanese in the Far East. There were local uprisings of peasants who resented requisitions of food. To the Bolsheviks, it seemed the entire world was against them. To the West, it seemed that if pressure was applied hard enough, the new regime would be crushed. Yet the Bolsheviks had two weapons that none of their enemies could match: ruthless discipline and a vision that promised the future. Lenin insisted that the party must be a vanguard, small but absolutely committed. He chose men like Trotsky to lead the Red Army, transforming a collection of volunteers into a force of millions. He relied on the Cheka, the secret police, to eliminate dissent and spread fear. And he constantly reminded his followers that they were not only fighting for power in Russia, they were fighting for a global cause, a cause that would set fire to the entire capitalist world. To the workers in Berlin, Paris, London, this language was not empty. They too had suffered through the war. Factories were restless, strikes broke out, socialist parties grew in strength. In 1919, revolutions shook Germany and Hungary. The Bolsheviks proclaimed that these were the first sparks of a world conflagration. The Comintern, the Third International, was created to give guidance to these movements. Its message was blunt. The Russian victory must be repeated everywhere. The workers of the world must unite in practice, not only in theory. This was the moment when the phrase "Red Scare" entered Western vocabulary. Governments looked at protests in their cities and saw the hand of Moscow behind every banner. In the United States in 1919 and 1920, strikes by steel and coal workers, bombings by radicals, and demonstrations for better wages were all interpreted as signs that Bolshevism was infiltrating the nation. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer launched raids that arrested thousands of suspected radicals. Civil liberties were curtailed in the name of protecting the Republic. The fear of revolution was so intense that it shaped American politics for decades. In Britain, the government watched uneasily as railway workers, miners, and dockers threatened to paralyze the economy. The press spoke of the danger of a general strike that could mimic the Russian example. In France, memories of the Paris Commune blended with new anxieties about Moscow's influence. In every European capital, the specter of Bolshevism was not a remote Russian drama, but a domestic threat, an infection that might cross borders through the minds of their own citizens. Inside Russia, the war was brutal beyond imagination. Entire cities were reduced to hunger. Epidemics of typhus and influenza killed millions. Grain requisitions stripped the countryside bare. Villages that resisted were burned. The Bolsheviks called it necessary sacrifice for the revolution. Their opponents called it barbarism. But whatever the name, the regime survived. Each victory, each survival through hardship, deepened the conviction among Bolsheviks that history was on their side. And each survival deepened the fear in the West that this new power was not going to disappear. Lenin never pretended that his methods were gentle. He spoke openly of terror as a weapon, of class enemies that had to be exterminated like pests. For Western observers, this was chilling. Diplomats who managed to visit Petrograd or Moscow sent back reports of shortages, executions, and yet also of extraordinary discipline. They described a society that was turning itself inside out, guided by an iron will. Some Western intellectuals were horrified, others were fascinated. A few even admired the audacity of trying to build a new world from ashes. The paradox of those years was that while Russia was bleeding, its image abroad was powerful. To a poor worker in Manchester or Chicago, the idea that in Russia factories had been taken over by councils of laborers was intoxicating. Whether or not the reality matched the propaganda, the vision mattered. Posters showed strong men and women striding forward under red banners. Books spoke of equality and liberation. For the industrial elites of the West, this was more dangerous than armies. It was the possibility that their own workers would demand the same. As the Civil War dragged on, the Western powers slowly withdrew their forces. The cost was too high. The public had no appetite for another war after the slaughter of the Great War. One by one, the interventions ended. The white armies collapsed, their leaders fled into exile, and by 1921, the Bolsheviks stood alone as victors. The impossible had happened. Against enemies more numerous, against hunger and disease, the new regime had endured. And with that endurance, it had won a kind of legitimacy, however grudging. The West faced a new reality, a state openly hostile to capitalism, openly calling for its destruction, now occupied 1/6 of the Earth's landmass. It was not a question of ideology alone. The Soviet Union, as it would soon be named, controlled resources, armies, and an idea that could not be contained by borders. The dream of world revolution had not materialized as Lenin had hoped, but the fear of it remained alive in every capital. The birth of the Red Threat was not only about what happened inside Russia, but about what people believed could happen in their own streets. The vision of workers taking control, of governments being swept away, was more contagious than any disease. Even as the Soviet state struggled to feed itself, it cast a shadow across the globe. The 20th century was just beginning, and already it was clear that one of its central dramas would be the confrontation between a capitalist West and a communist East. The Civil War ended with a ruined country, but a victorious regime. Out of ruins, a new kind of power was emerging. And for the West, the question was no longer whether it would survive, but how far it would reach. When the smoke of the Civil War settled, the new Soviet state stood alive but deeply wounded. The land was devastated, railways broken, villages stripped bare, factories silent, millions dead from hunger and disease. For Lenin and his comrades, the survival itself was victory. But survival required more than slogans. The revolution had to feed its people, rebuild its economy, and convince the world that it was not a fleeting aberration. Out of this crisis came a temporary compromise that Lenin called the New Economic Policy. The New Economic Policy was born in 1921, when strikes and peasant uprisings threatened to engulf the fragile regime. Lenin admitted that war communism had pushed the people to the edge. The new policy allowed small-scale private trade, permitted peasants to sell their surplus on the market, and encouraged some entrepreneurs to revive industry. To radicals, it felt like betrayal, a retreat back toward capitalism. To Lenin, it was a tactical maneuver, a breathing space, a way to hold power until socialism could be built on firmer ground. The West watched this with suspicion. Some believed the Bolsheviks had been forced to abandon their dream. Others warned that it was only a mask, a pause before a renewed assault. For foreign investors, there was a flicker of interest, but governments remained wary. They had not forgotten the repudiation of debts, the execution of the royal family, the rhetoric of world revolution. The Soviet Union was tolerated, sometimes even engaged diplomatically, but never trusted. Inside the party, the question of the future burned. Lenin, already weakened by strokes, could not dominate as he once had. A struggle began for succession, a struggle that would shape the century. The central figures were Trotsky, brilliant, charismatic, the architect of the Red Army, and Stalin, less dazzling but relentless, a man of organization, of detail, of patience. Others circled as well: Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, each with supporters. But in the end, history turned toward Stalin. Lenin's death in 1924 created a vacuum. His final writings hinted at fears of Stalin's growing power, but they were not enough to stop him. Trotsky, despite his intellect and fame, hesitated, misjudged, and found himself isolated. Stalin maneuvered carefully, forming alliances, breaking them, building a base within the party apparatus. His doctrine of socialism in one country appealed to a weary nation. Instead of endless calls for world revolution, he promised that the Soviet Union itself could become the fortress of socialism, secure and powerful in its own right. For the West, this shift was unsettling in a new way. Trotsky's rhetoric of global uprising had been frightening, but there was comfort in its impracticality. Stalin's promise to focus on building a strong state within Russia suggested something more concrete, a rival power that might actually endure and compete. During the later 20s, the new economic policy still lingered. Markets bustled in towns, peasants traded grain, but Stalin began to turn the tide. He denounced the policy as a retreat, condemned the so-called kulaks, wealthier peasants, as enemies. He argued that only rapid industrialization and collective farming could secure socialism. His speeches painted a picture of a hostile world encircling the Soviet Union, eager to crush it. To survive, he insisted, the nation must transform itself at once, with speed and ruthlessness. What followed was one of the most dramatic and violent social revolutions in history. Villages were forced into collective farms, peasants stripped of land, millions deported or killed. Grain was requisitioned to feed the cities and to export for machines. At the same time, gigantic industrial projects rose. Dams across the Dnieper, new steel cities in the Urals, tractor factories, railways stretching into the wilderness. The Soviet Union was remaking itself in less than a decade, moving from an agrarian land to an industrial power. To the people inside the country, it was a storm of change, often a storm of suffering. To the West, it looked like the birth of a colossus. Reports from foreign engineers who worked on Soviet projects spoke of scale and ambition never seen before. Photographs showed armies of workers, banners proclaiming that the future was being built. Some observers admired the dynamism, even envied it during the Great Depression when Western economies faltered. Others saw only tyranny, forced labor, and mountains of corpses hidden behind propaganda. The consolidation of Stalin's power was accompanied by the tightening of control. Opposition within the party was silenced. Trotsky was driven into exile, hounded across continents until his assassination in Mexico years later. Former allies were denounced as traitors, arrested, or shot. The machinery of repression grew ever larger, with camps in Siberia swallowing those who resisted or were merely suspected. By the early 30s, Stalin stood unchallenged as the supreme leader. For Western governments, the picture was double-edged. On one hand, Stalin seemed to have abandoned the dream of immediate world revolution. On the other, he was building a state that looked more formidable each year. Newspapers in Europe and America debated endlessly. Was the Soviet experiment doomed to collapse under its contradictions? Or was it creating a new model that might overshadow the capitalist order? The fear was not only of ideology, but of capacity. An industrial, disciplined Soviet Union could become a force on the global stage, militarily as well as economically. And so the West watched as Stalin's Soviet Union emerged from the chaos of Lenin's time into something harder, darker, more enduring. The Bolsheviks had survived the Civil War by sheer will. Under Stalin, they were forging a system that did not merely survive, but commanded. The price in human lives was staggering, but for Stalin, the price was necessary, and for the West, the spectacle was alarming. The story of socialism in one country was becoming a story of socialism as a fortress whose walls were built of fear, steel, and sacrifice. Within those walls, a new kind of power was forming, a power that unsettled observers abroad and forced them to imagine a world where communism was not a passing fever, but a permanent rival. By the late 1930s, the Soviet Union had become a paradox that the West could not ignore. It was a state built on fear and repression, yet it had transformed itself from a backward agrarian empire into an industrial giant within a single generation. It executed its own leaders in show trials that horrified observers, yet it completed colossal projects that amazed foreign engineers. For ordinary people in Europe and America, the image of Stalin's Russia was confusing. Some saw it as a worker's paradise, others as a living nightmare. Governments, however, judged it with one common conclusion. It was a rival power, and it was not going away. The rise of Nazi Germany forced the world to recalculate. At first, many in the West wondered if Stalin and Hitler were two sides of the same coin, totalitarian regimes born of the chaos of war and depression. The signing of the Non-Aggression Pact in 1939 seemed to confirm this view. When the Soviet Union invaded eastern Poland and later moved into the Baltic states, Western commentators described a cynical empire carving up Europe alongside the Nazis. Yet this picture changed dramatically when in the summer of 1941, Hitler turned on his ally and hurled his armies eastward in the largest invasion in history. In that instant, the Soviet Union became an ally of the very powers that had feared it most. Churchill, who had once denounced Bolshevism as a pestilence, now declared support for Stalin. Roosevelt opened supplies under Lend-Lease. Western public opinion shifted. The Red Army, once portrayed as a tool of tyranny, was suddenly the shield standing between Europe and Nazi domination. Journalists who traveled to Moscow described a city under siege, a people fighting with unimaginable sacrifice. The narrative of communism as threat did not vanish, but it was overlaid by the urgent reality of alliance. The war turned into a crucible for the Soviet state. The German invasion brought horrors beyond description. Entire cities such as Leningrad starved for years under blockade. Villages were burned, millions were killed or enslaved. Yet the Red Army held, bled, and counterattacked. Factories were dismantled and rebuilt east of the Urals, producing tanks and aircraft at a speed that stunned Western observers. Soviet soldiers fought street by street, house by house, until the tide turned at Stalingrad, that monumental battle that broke the myth of Nazi invincibility. For the West, the spectacle was double-edged. On one side, admiration for the courage and the cost, for the millions who gave their lives to stop Hitler. On the other, fear of what this revealed, a society capable of mobilizing every resource, every man and woman, under the command of the state. The discipline that had once seemed cruel now appeared terrifyingly effective. The Soviet Union was proving not only that it could survive, but that it could triumph. By 1945, the Red Army marched into Berlin. The hammer and sickle was raised above the Reichstag. The world saw that the Soviet Union had paid the highest price in blood for victory, and that it emerged from the war not broken, but powerful. Entire swathes of Eastern Europe were now under its control, liberated from the Nazis but bound by the presence of Soviet troops. In London and Washington, the celebrations of victory were already shaded by unease. A new division was forming, a line across the continent. The years that followed brought the term that would define the era, the Cold War. Churchill spoke of an Iron Curtain descending across Europe. In Washington, strategists debated how to contain the spread of communism. In Moscow, Stalin spoke of rebuilding, but also of vigilance against the capitalist encirclement. Both sides saw the other not merely as a rival, but as a mortal threat. The old fear of the Red Scare had returned, magnified by the reality that the Soviet Union was now a superpower with armies, with ideology, and soon with nuclear weapons. For ordinary people in the West, communism became a shadow that touched every part of life. Newspapers spoke of spies, of infiltration, of workers' parties funded by Moscow. School children in America practiced drills against atomic attack, imagining bombs that might fall from the skies. In Europe, political debates were shaped by the question of how close to Moscow one might be willing to stand. In films, novels, speeches, the figure of Lenin and Stalin loomed as symbols of a system that promised equality but delivered fear, a system that offered hope to the oppressed yet terrified the established order. The legacy of Lenin was the idea that a small group could seize power and claim to speak for the masses. The legacy of Stalin was the demonstration that such power could be consolidated, expanded, and projected across the globe. Together, they created not only a state but a rival model of civilization, one that unsettled the West at its very core. Capitalism had faced rivals before, but never one so vast, so armed with conviction, so determined to spread. By the time Stalin died in 1953, the world had been reshaped. The Soviet Union held half of Europe, influenced revolutions in Asia, and inspired movements in Africa and Latin America. The West lived with the constant knowledge that communism was not a theory in dusty books, but a living force that might reach into their cities, their politics, their future. The dream that Lenin had kindled and the fortress that Stalin had built had become one of the central realities of the 20th century. The story did not end with them. Others would rise: Khrushchev, Brezhnev, the long decades of rivalry that followed. But the foundation was laid in those first turbulent decades, when an idea born in exile seized a crumbling empire and transformed it into a power that defined an age. The West had hoped the experiment would fail quickly. Instead, it endured, expanded, and cast a cold shadow across generations. That shadow was not only political or military, it was psychological, a constant pressure in the minds of leaders and citizens alike. Could capitalism outlast communism? Could freedom outlast discipline? Would history belong to markets or to planned economies? These were not academic questions. They shaped policies, wars, and fears for half a century. Looking back, the rise of Lenin and Stalin was not only the story of Russia. It was the story of the world learning that ideas could move armies, that belief could redraw maps, that visions could unsettle entire civilizations. And it was the story of how the West, confident in its own systems, found itself facing a mirror image, dark and unyielding, that challenged everything it assumed about progress and power. The 20th century cannot be understood without them. Lenin, the theorist, the revolutionary who believed the future could be seized with force. Stalin, the builder, the tyrant who turned ideology into concrete and steel. Together, they created a force that unsettled the world, a force that stood as both inspiration and nightmare. And long after their deaths, the echo of their work still lingers, reminding us how fragile the balance of history can be when ideas become empires. Subscribe. Не прощаемся.